The conference room smelled like old coffee that nobody had offered to pour. A fluorescent tube above the table buzzed with the faint, persistent hum of a thing that should have been replaced years ago, and directly beneath it, a water stain on the ceiling tile had been spreading so long it looked almost deliberate, like a map of some country no one wanted to visit. The table itself was particle board dressed in fake walnut veneer, and seated around it were 5 people whose lives were about to be divided up with the same efficiency as the assets listed on the document Harold Kemp was reading aloud. Ruth Alder sat on one side, alone. She was 58 years old, wearing the only blazer she owned, a navy one she had bought 3 years earlier for her father's funeral. Across from her sat Glenn Fitch, 61, her husband of 26 years, though the word husband had stopped meaning anything long before this afternoon. Beside Glenn were his 2 adult children from his first marriage. Tara, 34, had her phone in her hand. Kyle, 31, was looking at the wall. Kemp read the items like a grocery list. The house at 412 Laurel Ridge Road, 4 bedrooms Ruth had painted herself, awarded to Glenn. The 2019 Subaru Outback, title transferred to Glenn. The joint savings, $187,400, already moved to Glenn's sole account as part of the settlement. The brokerage account, the life insurance cash value, the timeshare deposit. Each line landed on the table with the soft thud of a pen tap, which Kemp delivered after every item, a habit that made the reading feel less like a legal proceeding and more like an auction where only one bidder had shown up. Tara made a note on her phone after each item. She did not look at Ruth. Then came the line about separate property. Kemp's voice didn't change, but Ruth's hands went still on the table. Parcel 1207441, known as the Alder Mill property, 12.4 acres on Buckner Creek. Structures included. All outstanding liens and obligations transferring to the title holder. Ruth Diane Alder. Glenn exhaled through his nose. It was something between a laugh and relief, a sound so small that only a woman who had spent 26 years reading his moods would have caught it. Tara didn't look up from her phone. Kyle shifted in his seat. No one contested the mill. No one wanted it. Ruth's eyes dropped to the line at the bottom of the disbursement sheet. Her checking account balance after all offsets, all transfers, all deductions, $2,114. That was what 26 years of marriage had distilled to. A 4-digit number and a deed to a building the county wanted to tear down. That mill, the one they were so relieved to leave off the spreadsheet, would prove to be the single most valuable asset anyone in that room had ever touched. But it would take Ruth Alder climbing down into water she couldn't see the bottom of to find out why. The mill sat on 12 acres of floodplain, a stone building with a caved-in west wall, $9,200 in back taxes, and an active county demolition order dated 4 months from now. Glenn's team had calculated it as a net negative. It would cost more to fix than the land was worth. That calculation was the last mistake anyone made about Ruth Alder's father. But to understand the mill, you have to understand the man who built his whole life around it. And to understand him, you have to go back to the funeral Ruth paid for alone. Ruth Diane Alder was born in 1965 in Buckner, North Carolina, a community so small it shared a zip code with the next town over. She was the only child of Emmett Alder and Dorothy Alder. Dorothy died of ovarian cancer when Ruth was 14, and after that it was just Ruth and her father, a quiet man who ran a stone-built grain mill on Buckner Creek that had been operational since 1921, when Emmett's father, Walter Alder, built it with river-rounded granite and his own hands. Emmett ground feed corn and wheat for local farms. He never made much money, but the mill was always open and the books were always clean. He taught Ruth to keep those books. By the time she was 16, she was reconciling the mill's ledger every Saturday morning at the kitchen table, her pencil moving down the columns, while Emmett sat on an oak stool and watched her work. He used to say that Ruth was the only person he had ever met who could not leave a column unbalanced. "She'll sit there until midnight," he told the feed supplier once, "before she lets a number go wrong." It was not a complaint. It was the closest thing to pride Emmett ever voiced. That trait defined her. Meticulous, patient, stubborn about accuracy. It made her a reliable caretaker, a careful accountant, and though she did not know it yet, a dangerous adversary in any dispute that involved a financial ledger. Ruth met Glenn Fitch in 1996 at a church fundraiser. He was a regional sales manager for a building supply company, recently divorced, with 2 young children. Tara was 8. Kyle was 5. Ruth was 31, had never married, and had spent her 20s helping Emmett run the mill and working as a bookkeeper at a hardware store in Hendersonville. Glenn was charming, organized, and seemed to respect her father. They married in 1997. For the first decade, the marriage functioned. Ruth moved into Glenn's house on Laurel Ridge Road. She kept working, eventually becoming the bookkeeper for a small property management firm. She helped raise Tara and Kyle, packed their lunches, drove them to school, sat at the kitchen table tutoring them through algebra, the same way she had once sat with Emmett's ledger. She drove to Buckner every weekend to check on her father and the mill. When Emmett's health began to decline in 2008, early-stage vascular dementia that crept in like fog off the creek, Ruth cut her work hours to 3 days a week to care for him. Glenn was initially supportive, then he wasn't. The crack formed the way most cracks do, not in a single blow, but in a slow pressure that neither of them named. Glenn resented the weekends lost to that mill. He resented the smell of creek water on Ruth's clothes when she came home Sunday evenings. He resented that Ruth spent her inheritance, $14,000 from Dorothy's small life insurance policy, untouched for 30 years, on a new roof for the mill building in 2011, instead of on the kitchen renovation he had been planning. By 2015, Glenn was sleeping in the guest room. By 2018, he had hired Harold Kemp. Emmett Older died on March 7, 2020, at 81. Vascular dementia, then pneumonia. Ruth was at his bedside in the final hours, holding his hand while the monitor traced lines that grew flatter and farther apart. Glenn did not come to the hospital. Tara sent a text that read, "Sorry about your dad." Kyle said nothing at all. The funeral cost $6,800. Ruth paid it from the joint savings account, the only time she had ever used that account for something personal. Glenn later cited it in the divorce filings as an unauthorized disbursement. $6,800 for the burial of a man she had cared for every weekend for 12 years. And it was listed in a legal document as evidence against her. Emmett left no will. Under North Carolina intestacy law, his sole heir was Ruth, his only child. The only asset in his estate was the mill property, already titled in his name, now passing to her. No cash, no investments, no insurance. Just 12 acres, a stone building, and a creek. Glenn's attorney listed the mill as Ruth's separate property and valued it at negative $4,600, accounting for the back taxes and the demolition lien. He was glad to leave it off the marital balance sheet. He considered it a favor. The divorce proceedings stretched from late 2018 to November 2023. 5 years, partly because of pandemic delays, partly because Glenn's attorney kept filing motions to reclassify the mill as marital property. Every motion failed. North Carolina's equitable distribution statute is clear. Property inherited by one spouse remains separate unless commingled with marital assets. Ruth had never put Glenn's name on the mill deed, had never deposited mill income into the joint account, because there was no mill income after 2009, and had paid the roof repair from her own inherited funds. The mill was hers and hers alone, but everything else was not. Glenn's financial disclosure listed the marital assets in columns that read like a summary of a life Ruth had helped build, and would walk away from empty-handed. The house, valued at $310,000. The Subaru, $22,000. The joint savings, $187,400. The brokerage account, $41,200. A timeshare deposit, $8,000. Glenn's 401k, $122,000. Life insurance cash value, $15,600. Total liquid and real assets on Glenn's side, over $700,000. Ruth's disclosure listed her separate property, the mill at negative $4,600, and her checking account at $2,114 after legal fees. Her 401 had been drained years earlier. She had taken hardship withdrawals during Emmett's care to cover home health aides when Medicare fell short. Roughly $38,000 gone to keep her father alive and comfortable. What remained was $2,114 and a building that was falling down. The settlement conference happened in Kemp's office, months before the final decree. Glenn sat across from Ruth and explained why the arrangement was fair. His voice was calm, transactional, the tone of a man discussing terms on a shipment of drywall. "You spent the last 5 years driving back and forth to that mill property every weekend," Glenn said. "You chose that over this marriage. I think the settlement reflects that." Ruth looked at him. "I was taking care of my father, and I was paying the mortgage." From the corner, Tara spoke without lifting her eyes from her phone. "Dad, can we move this along? I have to pick up Bryn from school." That was the sound of it. Not a slammed door or a raised voice. Just a woman asking to speed up the process of erasing her stepmother from the books so she could get to the school pickup on time. Both stepchildren had given depositions supporting Glenn's claim that Ruth had abandoned the marriage by prioritizing Emmett's care. The depositions were bland, coached, legalistic, but they were there. Tara and Kyle, the children Ruth had driven to school and packed lunches for and sat with at the kitchen table until the algebra made sense, had signed affidavits saying she was absent from the home. Ruth read those depositions in Kemp's office, each page a quiet little demolition of something she had believed was mutual. The final decree came in November 2023. The judge approved the settlement. Glenn kept the house, the car, the savings, the brokerage, the timeshare, the 401, the insurance. Ruth's share of the marital estate, after offsets, 0. The judge noted that Ruth's separate property, the mill, was excluded from distribution, but that its negative value offset any claim she might have to additional marital assets. Ruth's attorney, a legal aid volunteer who had taken the case pro bono, objected. The objection was overruled. Ruth signed the final page with a blue ballpoint pen that had the logo of the property management firm on it. A pen from a job she no longer had, because she had been laid off during the proceedings. She heard the printer in the next room spitting out copies. She heard Tara tapping on her phone. And she walked out with a checking account balance of $2,114, a suitcase in the trunk of a borrowed car, and a deed to a building the county wanted to tear down. After the decree, Ruth had nowhere to go. Her father's cottage on the same 12 acres as the mill had been condemned by the county in 2021 due to foundation rot from repeated flooding. It was uninhabitable. The mill itself had no plumbing, no insulation, and a west wall that had partially collapsed after a windstorm in 2019. The county's demolition order gave her until March 15, 2024, 4 months, to either bring the structure up to code or vacate so they could tear it down. The county's estimate for remediation was $45,000. Ruth had $2,114. Glenn, in a deposition taken months earlier, had described the mill property as a liability. He said it had been non-operational since 2009. The structure was partially collapsed, and any reasonable assessment valued it below 0. Tara had been more concise. A text to Kyle that surfaced during discovery put it plainly. "Let her have the mill, lol. It's basically a pile of rocks next to a ditch." Kyle, in his deposition, had said he didn't have an opinion about the mill. He had only been there twice. Ruth could have walked away. She could have signed a quitclaim to the county. Let them demolish the building. Let the land go to tax sale. Her legal aid attorney told her it was the rational choice. "You'd be rid of the tax burden and the lien," he said. "There's nothing there, Ruth." But Ruth did not sign. She did not refuse because she believed the mill held a fortune. She refused because it was her father's, because she had helped him keep books there every Saturday morning, because the oak stool he always sat on was probably still inside, under the dust and the plaster and the rainwater, because her name was older, and the mill was older, and she was not going to be the one who let them knock it down. She drove to Buckner in a borrowed Ford Ranger the next morning. November 19th, 2023. Temperature 38 degrees. The truck's heater didn't work on the passenger side, but there was no passenger. The road wound through bare hardwoods, grey sky, the smell of wood smoke from someone else's chimney. Ruth could have driven to Buckner with her eyes closed. The mill was exactly as bad as everyone said. Worse, maybe. But the creek was still running and the foundation was still standing. And there was one thing inside that Ruth did not expect to find. The gravel road forked off County Road 1140, a quarter-mile past the condemned cottage, and the ruts were half washed out from the last flood. Ruth parked the borrowed Ranger at the top of the hill because she was not sure the road would hold the truck's weight after the rain. She walked down. The older mill was a two-story stone building, native granite, built in 1921 by Walter Alder. The stones were massive, some of them 2 feet across, river-rounded, mortared with lime and aggregate. The west wall had a breach about 8 feet wide where the upper story had collapsed inward during a windstorm. 4 years earlier, the roof over that section was open sky. The rest of the roof was slate, mostly intact, a few tiles missing, but the bones were still good. The loading door on the south face was oak, swollen shut from moisture, the iron hinges rusted but unbroken. Buckner Creek ran 30 feet from the mill's east wall. The old mill race, the channel that once diverted water to the wheel, was silted in but still visible, a depression in the ground lined with the same granite. The water wheel had been gone since the 1960s, removed when Emmett converted to electric power, but the sluice gate, a heavy cast-iron mechanism that had once controlled the water flow into the race, was still in place, half buried in sediment and leaves. Ruth forced the loading door open. The hinges groaned but held. Inside, the ground floor was the old milling room. The millstones, 2 of them each 4 feet in diameter, granite, were still in their housing on the floor, the upper stone resting on the lower. The wooden hopper above had rotted and collapsed. Feed dust coated everything, mixed now with plaster from the fallen wall and years of leaves blown in through the breach. Water damage was extensive on the west side. The floor was flagstone over-packed earth, and it was wet in patches where rain entered through the gap. The east side, protected by the intact roof, was drier. Against the east wall stood a wooden workbench, warped but standing. A row of iron hooks where tools once hung. A doorway led to a narrow stair that climbed to the upper story, the grain loft. The back taxes, $9,200. The demolition deadline, March 15th. The county's estimate to remediate, $45,000. Ruth's remaining money, $2,114. And then she saw the cat. A grey barn cat, thin, with a torn left ear and a notch in its tail, was sitting on the lower millstone as if it owned the building. It watched Ruth without moving. It did not run. Ruth stood still. The cat blinked. Ruth said out loud, "To no one, well, at least somebody stayed." She would call it spool, because the next day she found it curled inside an empty wooden thread spool on the workbench, one of the old mill spools Emmett had used for twine. Spool would not leave the mill for the duration of anything that followed. Ruth spent the first 3 days doing triage. She brought a broom, garbage bags, a tarp for the west wall breach. She slept in the borrowed truck the first night, then in a sleeping bag on the dry side of the milling floor after she swept it clean. She ate gas station sandwiches and drank water from a jug she filled at the gas station. She was methodical about it, the bookkeeper in survival mode, working from one corner to the next, clearing debris in order. On the 3rd day, she went to examine the sluice gate on the east wall, where the mill race met the creek. She wanted to see if the gate mechanism was salvageable. If she could divert water to the mill, she might at least have running water for cleaning. The sluice gate was a cast-iron plate controlled by a screw mechanism, set into a stone channel. It hadn't been opened in years. Sediment, leaves, and root matter were packed around it. Ruth knelt in the cold mud and started clearing the debris with her hands. Underneath the sediment, at the base of the sluice gate stone housing, she found a row of bolts. Not old bolts. Not 1921 construction bolts. These were stainless steel hex bolts, modern, set into the stone with expansion anchors. They were fastening something to the underside of the gate housing, something that had been installed deliberately after the mill was built, by someone who wanted it to stay hidden. Ruth counted the bolts, 6 of them arranged in a rectangle roughly 12 inches by 18 inches. The pattern suggested a plate or a box bolted flush against the stone, concealed by years of accumulated sediment. She didn't have a socket wrench. She could have ignored it. She could have come back to it later or never come back to it at all. But the bookkeeper in her had found a number that didn't add up. Stainless steel bolts in a granite wall, built in 1921. And she could not let it go. She drove to the hardware store in Hendersonville, bought a socket set with $11.47 of her remaining money, and drove back. She removed the 6 bolts, kneeling in the mud beside the creek, the November water seeping through her jeans at the knee. Behind them was a fireproof lockbox, commercial grade, roughly the size of a briefcase, painted dark green, bolted flush into a cavity that had been chiseled into the stone. The chisel marks were still visible, precise and deliberate. Someone with patience and a masonry chisel had carved a niche into the sluice gate housing, installed the box, and sealed it behind the bolts and the sediment. She pulled the box free. It was heavy, maybe 20 pounds, sealed with a combination lock. She tried Emmett's birthday, 07/12/39. Nothing. Her mother's birthday, 03/04/45. Nothing. Her own birthday, 09/22/65. Nothing. Then she tried the date the mill was built. The date chiseled into the cornerstone of the building. The date she had grown up seeing every Saturday morning of her childhood. 04/11/21. The lock opened. She lifted the lid 2 inches. Inside she could see paper, documents, envelopes, something thick. And on top, resting loose, a single object that caught the light before she processed anything else. It was a small brass plate, about the size of a playing card, the kind used to mark high water levels on bridge abutments and dam walls. It was engraved with letters and numbers she recognized immediately as her father's hand, even rendered in metal. EA, 1983, survey complete. What's below the waterline is what holds the wall up. Ruth read the line. She read it again. She recognized the cadence. Emmett talked like that, always, in structural metaphors, in mill language. Below the waterline. She looked at the creek running 30 feet away, brown with November rain, the water level well above the silted-in mill race. EA for Emmett Alder, 1983, survey complete. That was the year Ruth had turned 18. The year she started keeping her father's books. Whatever Emmett Alder had surveyed, whatever he had measured below the waterline, he had started it the same year he trusted his daughter with the numbers. She closed the lockbox. She did not dump its contents in the mud beside the creek. She carried it inside, set it on the workbench, and decided she would go through it in order, carefully, the way she would go through a ledger. Numbers first, then meaning. She would begin the next morning, and the box on the workbench had more to say. The next morning, Ruth opened the lockbox on the workbench with a combination she now knew by heart. On top, beneath the brass water level marker she had already examined, was a folded piece of lined paper in Emmett's handwriting. Not the sealed envelope she could feel beneath the other documents. This was a note, loose, folded once, placed where it would be the first thing read. She unfolded it. Emmett's hand, steady and plain, the same hand that had written columns of corn weights and flour yields in the mill's ledger for 40 years. Ruthie, if you're reading this, then you kept it. I knew you would. Go up to the loft. East wall, behind the 3rd panel from the door. I left you everything I found under this creek. Love, Dad. Ruth sat on the stool beside the workbench and realized with a shock that traveled from her hands into her chest that the stool was the oak stool, the one Emmett had sat on every Saturday morning while she worked the numbers. It had survived. It was here. She pressed her palms flat against the seat and felt the wood grain worn smooth by decades of use. And for a moment, the mill was not a ruin. It was Saturday morning, and her father was nearby, and the ledger was open. She climbed the narrow stairs to the grain loft. The upper story was half open to the sky on the west side where the wall had collapsed, but intact on the east. The east wall was lined with tongue-and-groove pine panels, darkened with age, some warped by moisture. She counted from the door. First panel, second panel, third panel. She pressed it. The panel swung inward on concealed hinges, silent, invisible when closed, the edges flush with the neighboring boards. Someone had built this to disappear. Behind the panel was a cavity in the stone wall, larger than the one at the sluice gate, roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. Inside the cavity was an army footlocker, olive drab, stenciled with the name W. Alder, Walter Alder, Emmett's father, who had built this mill and who had served in the army in the 1940s. The footlocker had been repurposed. Ruth pulled it out and carried it downstairs. She set it on the workbench beside the lockbox, opened the clasps, and lifted the lid. Inside were 3 rolled survey maps and 2 mineral rights certificates. The maps were dated 1982 and 1983, commissioned by Emmett Alder through the North Carolina Geological Survey's Small Landowner Program. They were topographic and subsurface, covering the 12.4 acres of the mill property. In colored pencil annotations in Emmett's hand, certain areas were circled and labeled: pegmatite outcrop, lithium bearing, spodumene confirmed, see certificate. The 2 mineral rights certificates were official documents from the Henderson County Register of Deeds, dated 1983, recording Emmett Alder's claim to the mineral rights beneath parcel 1207441. Under North Carolina law, mineral rights can be severed from surface rights and filed as a separate claim. Emmett had done exactly that in 1983, quietly, when he was 44 years old, the same year his daughter started keeping his books. The certificates were stamped, recorded, and valid. In the margin of the first survey map, in pencil, Emmett had written a note. It was longer than the instructions he had left in the lockbox, and it was written not as a direction but as a memory. They told me the creek wasn't good for anything but flooding. I paid a geologist $300 to tell me what the creek was cutting through. He said I was standing on a pegmatite vein, the kind that carries lithium. I asked what that meant. He said it meant I should file a mineral claim before someone else did. I filed it the next week. Then I went home and watched Ruth finish the ledger. Lithium. In 1983 it was a mineral used primarily in ceramics, glass, and psychiatric medicine. Valuable but not extraordinary. By the 2020s, it had become one of the most strategically important minerals on Earth. Essential for electric vehicle batteries, grid-scale energy storage, and portable electronics. Emmett Alder could not have known in 1983 what lithium would be worth 40 years later. But he had known enough to file the mineral claim and secure the rights. He had known enough to hide the evidence inside the walls of his own building, where no one would look unless they had a reason to stay. What Emmett had found under his creek explained why he hid things inside the mill. He was not eccentric. He was protecting a discovery. But the survey maps opened a new question. One Ruth turned over in her mind as she sat with the documents spread across the workbench. Spool sat on the millstone, watching, as if supervising. The wind moved through the breach in the west wall. The paper was brittle under Ruth's fingers, and the colored pencil annotations had faded, but were still legible. The question was this. The mineral rights had been filed in 1983. They were in Emmett's name. Had he done anything with them after that? Had he transferred them, leased them, or set up some structure to protect them? And if so, why had he never told her? Ruth spent 2 days reading the survey maps line by line, the way she had read every ledger she had ever been handed. Completely, in order, missing nothing. The smell of old canvas from the footlocker, the brittleness of the paper, and the handwriting, the same handwriting she had seen every Saturday in the mill's ledger, all of it grounded her in a strange double awareness. She was discovering something new and recognizing something old at the same time. On the second day, she noticed a notation she did not understand. On the third map, in Emmett's hand, there was an arrow pointing to the location of the millstones on the ground floor, with the words, "See axle housing full drawing." She went back downstairs. The older mill used a traditional arrangement. A stationary bedstone on the bottom, and a rotating runner stone on top, driven by a vertical spindle connected originally to the water wheel, and after the 1960s, to an electric motor. The axle housing was a wooden and iron assembly beneath the runner stone that held the spindle in place. To access it, you had to lift the runner stone, a 4-foot granite disc weighing approximately 1,500 pounds. Ruth could not lift it alone. She spent a full day rigging a lever system, using a length of oak beam from the collapsed west wall as the lever and a stack of granite blocks as the fulcrum. It was physical, slow, punishing work. She was 58. Her hands blistered on the beam, her shoulders burned. Spool watched from the workbench with the composed indifference of a creature that has never been asked to lift anything. She levered the runner stone up 8 inches, just enough to wedge a block under it and reach into the axle housing below. Inside, rolled into a copper tube capped at both ends to keep moisture out, the kind of tube used for plumbing, she found a hand-drawn schematic on heavy drafting paper. The drawing was precise, technical, done in India ink, the kind of drawing a man with engineering aptitude and decades of patience would make. It showed a cross-section of the 12.4 acres, from the surface down to a depth of about 120 feet. It mapped the pegmatite vein, its width, its depth, its angle of dip into the earth. Annotations in Emmett's hand noted the lithium content estimates from the 1983 survey, and, critically, the results of a second, private survey commissioned in 1997 by a licensed geologist named Dr. Hal Fredrickson. The 1997 survey confirmed and expanded the 1983 findings. The deposit was larger than Emmett had initially thought. Much larger. On the back of the schematic, in pencil, lighter and more personal than the India ink precision on the front, Emmett had written, "Ruthie keeps a ledger nobody asks to see. She's done it since she was 16. She never missed a Saturday. I keep this drawing nobody asks to see. We're the same that way. The difference is, mine will make sure she never has to ask anyone for anything, the day she finally needs it. I just hope that day never comes." 1997. The year Ruth married Glenn. Emmett had the deposit confirmed the same year his daughter walked down the aisle. He was already thinking ahead, already measuring the distance between what Ruth had and what she might lose. He was building a safety net under the floor. She didn't know had a floor. Ruth set the schematic on the workbench next to the survey maps and the footlocker. She did not call anyone. She did not call a lawyer, a geologist, or the county. She went back to the lockbox and looked at what remained inside. A thick manila envelope sealed with dark red wax, with her name on it in Emmett's hand, and underneath the envelope, another document, a legal document, folded, with a blue backing sheet. She picked up the legal document first. The bookkeeper's instinct, processed the data before the letter, numbers first, then meaning. She unfolded the blue-backed document, and the room changed. It was a trust instrument, an irrevocable trust, established in 1997, titled the Emmett W. Older Mineral Rights Trust. It had been drafted by an attorney named Colleen Voss, of Voss and Draper in Asheville, North Carolina. It was notarized, witnessed, and recorded. The terms were clear and deliberate. Emmett Walter Older was the grantor. Colleen Voss and her successors of the firm was the trustee. The sole beneficiary was Ruth Diane Older. The trust corpus was all mineral rights associated with parcel 1207441, as filed with the Henderson County Register of Deeds in 1983. The trust was irrevocable. The mineral rights were held in trust for Ruth's sole benefit. They could not be reached by creditors of the estate, could not be transferred without the beneficiary's consent, and were not subject to equitable distribution in any divorce proceeding, because they were held in trust, not in Ruth's individual name. Upon Emmett's death, the trustee was authorized to contact the beneficiary and disperse the trust assets. If the beneficiary had not been contacted within 3 years of the grantor's death, the trust assets remained in trust until the beneficiary presented herself. Emmett had set up the trust in 1997, the year Ruth married Glenn. He had transferred the mineral rights into the trust that same year. The mineral rights were not part of Emmett's probate estate, They had not passed through intestacy to Ruth directly. They were already in trust for her. The trust was a separate legal entity. Glenn's attorney could not have discovered it through a standard title search of the mill property, because the mineral rights had been severed from the surface and held in a trust that was not in Emmett's name at the time of his death. The mineral rights were never commingled with marital assets. They were Ruth's, and they had been Ruth's since 1997, locked inside a structure her father built as carefully as he had built the mill itself. Emmett had seen Glenn. He had measured Glenn the way he measured the creek, quietly, over time, with precision. He had seen the kitchen renovation argument. He had seen the resentment. He had not told Ruth, because he did not want her to have to choose between defending an asset and trying to save her marriage. He built the structure, hid the documents, and waited. On the outside of the trust document envelope, in Emmett's hand, was a note, "Ruth, I put this in a trust so no one can take it from you. Not a husband, not a judge, not a creditor. It's yours the way the ledger was yours, because you're the one who showed up." Inside the trust document envelope, beneath the legal papers, Ruth found a birthday card. It was yellowed at the edges, the front printed with a drawing of a bluebird, the kind of card from the dollar store in Hendersonville. Inside, in Emmett's hand, it read, "Happy birthday, Ruthie. I know you think I just run a mill. But I've been paying attention. You married a man who counts everything except what matters. I hope I'm wrong. This card is the only copy of the trust number, 974418MA. If you ever need it, you'll know where to look. Love, Dad." September 22nd, 1997. Ruth's 32nd birthday. She remembered getting this card. She remembered the bluebird on the front. Remembered thinking the note inside was just Emmett being Emmett. A little odd, a little cryptic. She had not understood the number. She had put the card in a box of keepsakes and forgotten it. Now she understood. She set the trust document and the birthday card on the workbench, and looked at the last object in the lockbox. The sealed envelope. Heavy manila, 9 by 12 inches, sealed with dark red candle wax pressed with the flat of a coin. She could see the faint impression of a quarter in the wax. Inside, she could feel by pressing folded paper more than one sheet, handwritten, the slight ridges of pen strokes visible through the envelope. On the front, in Emmett's hand, for Ruth, "When you're ready." She held the envelope up to the afternoon light coming through the loading door. The ghost of handwriting showed through the paper, and the first word was legible. Ruthie. She put the envelope down. She was not ready. Not because she was afraid of what it said, because she had spent the last 4 days discovering that her father had built her a fortress without ever telling her, and she needed to sit with that before she read his last words. She put the envelope back in the lockbox, closed the lid, and locked it again with the combination 041121. She would open it when the mill was worth opening it in. When she had earned what her father left, Ruth locked the box and put it back on the workbench. She did not know it yet, but someone had already started asking about the mill, not because they had heard about the footlocker, or the schematic, or the trust, but because a name, older, had appeared on a mineral rights registry that a mining company's land agent had been paid to search. And the land agent had made a phone call, not to Ruth, to Glenn. Before we go any further, if this story has caught you, if you're still here at this point, I'd ask you to subscribe. Not because I'll remind you again, because I won't, but because the stories on this channel are about the people who get written off the spreadsheet and what they find when they refuse to leave the building. The part that comes next is the part Ruth almost didn't survive. The mining company was called Appalachian Mineral Partners, a mid-size firm based in Charlotte that had been acquiring lithium mineral leases across western North Carolina as part of the growing domestic lithium supply chain. Their land agent, a man named Carter Wells, was tasked with identifying parcels that had existing mineral rights claims, which might be available for lease or purchase. He searched the Henderson County Registry of Deeds and found the 1983 mineral rights claim filed by Emmett Alder on parcel 1207441. Wells checked the status. The mineral rights had been transferred to the Emmett W. Alder Mineral Rights Trust in 1997. The trustee was listed as Colleen Voss, attorney, Asheville. Wells called Voss and Draper. He learned that the trust beneficiary was Ruth Diane Alder. He looked up Ruth Alder, and he found the divorce, public record. He found Glenn Fitch's name. He found the property valuation, negative $4,600. Wells called Glenn, not because Glenn had any legal claim, but because Wells was a salesman, and salesmen find leverage. He mentioned casually that he had been looking into mineral rights on the old Alder property. He asked if Glenn knew anything about it. Glenn didn't, but now Glenn was interested. And Glenn called Tara, December 14th, 2023, 3.5 weeks after Ruth had arrived at the mill. She was on her knees in the milling room, cleaning the flagstone floor with a wire brush, when she heard a car on the gravel road. Not the borrowed Ranger, which she had left at the top of the hill. A different car, a black Lexus SUV. Glenn and Tara came through the loading door without knocking. Glenn was wearing a coat Ruth had bought him 3 Christmases ago. Tara was carrying a folder. "Ruth, we need to talk." Ruth did not stand up. She stayed on her knees on the flagstone. "About what?" "About the property," Tara said. "About what, Dad?" "Your dad left here." "My dad left me a mill." "You all read the decree." Glenn's voice was controlled, transactional, the same energy he had brought to the divorce. "Ruth, don't make this harder than it has to be. There's a company asking about mineral rights. Mineral rights that may have been part of the marital estate." Ruth stood up now. "They weren't. Harold says they might have been." The scene sat in the milling room like cold water. Glenn did not raise his voice. Tara's presence was strategic, there to appear like family, to soften the approach, to make Ruth feel outnumbered in her own building. Spool retreated to the millstone when the strangers entered. Ruth asked them to leave. They did. But Tara left the folder on the workbench next to the lockbox. Inside the folder was a letter from Harold Kemp, on firm letterhead, asserting that mineral rights associated with the mill property may constitute marital property subject to equitable distribution, and that Glenn's legal team intended to file a motion to reopen the divorce settlement. Ruth put the folder on the workbench, crisp and professional beside Emmett's dusty lockbox, and went back to scrubbing the floor. Harold Kemp filed the motion on December 22nd, 2023. 3 days before Christmas. The motion to reopen the divorce settlement was based on the claim that Emmett Alder's mineral rights, having been filed in 1983 and transferred to a trust in 1997, constituted a known but undisclosed asset that Ruth had failed to include in her financial disclosure during the divorce. The legal theory was not that the mineral rights were marital property. Kemp knew they were separate. The theory was that Ruth's failure to disclose the trust's existence constituted fraud on the court, and that the settlement should be reopened so the mineral rights value could be considered in the overall equitable distribution. If the motion succeeded, the judge could reopen the entire settlement. Ruth could be ordered to share not the mineral rights themselves, which were protected by the trust, but an equivalent value from any future lease proceeds. The trust shielded the rights from direct seizure. It did not necessarily shield Ruth from a court ordering her to pay Glenn a share of the value as part of a revised deal. January 8th, 2024. Ruth received service of process at the mill. She had 20 days to respond. January 9th. She called her former legal aid attorney. He was sympathetic but said this was now a complex property rights and trust matter beyond his expertise. He referred her to Colleen Voss, the trustee named in Emmett's trust. January 11th. Ruth drove to Asheville. Colleen Voss was 71, semi-retired, and had been holding the trust file for 26 years. Her office was small, neat, and full of file cabinets that looked like they could tell 100 stories each. She had a copy of the trust instrument, the recorded mineral rights claim, and crucially, a receipt showing that she had sent Ruth a certified letter in March 2021, 1 year after Emmett's death, informing her of the trust's existence and inviting her to contact the firm. The letter had been sent to 412 Laurel Ridge Road, Glenn's house. Ruth had never received it. This was the second act of betrayal. Glenn had intercepted the trust notification letter. Whether he had read it and understood it, or simply thrown it away because it was addressed to Ruth at his house, and he did not care, the letter had never reached her. Voss assessed the situation. The motion would likely fail. The mineral rights had been transferred to the trust in 1997, before the marriage was even a year old. The trust was irrevocable. Ruth had not failed to disclose an asset. She had not known the trust existed. The certified letter that would have informed her had been sent to a marital address from which she was effectively excluded. The trust had not been created by Ruth, but by Emmett. Ruth could not have disclosed what she did not know, but a hearing would be required. The judge would need to see the trust instrument, the mineral rights filing, the chain of title, and evidence of the intercepted letter. And if Glenn's attorney could show that Ruth had known about the mineral rights, even without the trust, the calculus changed. Ruth had known her father surveyed the property. She just hadn't known what he found. Voss agreed to represent Ruth and the trust. Her retainer was $5,000. Ruth had about $1,800 left. Voss waived the retainer. She did this because Emmett Alder had paid her fees in full in 1997. $12,000 for the trust creation, the mineral rights transfer, and 25 years of trustee services, and she considered the work already compensated. But she told Ruth something else, something that landed in the small office like a stone dropping into still water. Your father came to me 26 years ago with a geological survey and a question. The question was, if my daughter marries the wrong man, how do I make sure she keeps what's hers? I told him an irrevocable trust. He said, do it today. He paid cash from a cigar box. He never came back, never called, never checked on it. He trusted that the structure would hold. And it held. The hearing was set for February 12, 2024. The weeks between January and February were the worst. Ruth was living in the mill. The west wall breach was tarped but not sealed. The temperature dropped below 20 degrees for 9 consecutive nights in late January. She heated the milling room with a wood stove she salvaged from the condemned cottage, hauled down the hill on a hand truck, alone, in the rain. She slept on a cot she bought at a thrift store for $15. Spool slept at the foot of the cot. The county's demolition deadline, March 15th, was approaching. If the mill was demolished, the surface property lost most of its practical value, and Glenn's attorney could argue that the demolition proved Ruth's inability to maintain the property, weakening her position in court. Ruth could not afford to remediate the mill. She could not afford to fight the demolition order. She had $1,800, a wood stove, and a cat. On the coldest nights, Ruth sat on Emmett's oak stool in the dark, the wood stove ticking as it cooled between feedings, and read the birthday card again. You married a man who counts everything except what matters. She wondered if her father had been protecting her from Glenn, or from the part of herself that stayed too long. She thought about the sealed envelope in the lockbox. She had not opened it. She thought, in those hours, that maybe the mill should come down. Maybe the county was right. The mineral rights were intact, the trust was protected, and she didn't need the building to access them. Maybe she should let it go and focus on the hearing. Then came the night of January 28th. Ruth could not sleep. She got up, lit the lamp, and opened the folder Tara had left on the workbench, the one from Harold Kemp. She had read it twice already, but tonight she read it differently. She read it like a bookkeeper. Kemp's motion included an exhibit, Glenn's financial disclosure from the divorce. Ruth had a copy of her own disclosure. She sat at the workbench with both documents and a pencil, and began to reconcile them, line by line, asset by asset, the way she had reconciled Emmett's ledger every Saturday morning for 30 years. By 3 a.m, she had found it. Glenn's financial disclosure had listed the joint savings account at $187,400. But the bank statements from the discovery phase of the divorce, which Ruth had kept because Ruth kept everything, showed that the account had held $224,600 as of the date of separation in 2018. The difference, $37,200. Glenn had withdrawn $37,200 from the joint account between the date of separation and the date of his disclosure, and he had not reported the withdrawal. This was not a rounding error. This was asset concealment during divorce proceedings, a sanctionable offense in North Carolina. Glenn's attorney, Harold Kemp, had signed the disclosure as accurate. Ruth did not call Voss at 3 in the morning. She finished the reconciliation. She documented every discrepancy with page references and dates. She organized the evidence into a folder, neat, numbered, tabbed, the work of a woman who had been trained since she was 16 to never leave a column unbalanced. She drove to Asheville the next morning. When she handed the folder to Colleen Voss, Voss read it in silence for 11 minutes. Then she looked at Ruth over the top of her glasses and said, "Your father told me you never left a ledger unfinished." He was right. Voss filed a counter-motion. She would not only defend against Glenn's attempt to reopen the settlement, she would present evidence of Glenn's asset concealment, which fatally undermined his claim that Ruth had committed fraud on the court, since he was the one who committed fraud. It exposed Harold Kemp to a Bar Association complaint for certifying an inaccurate disclosure, and it potentially entitled Ruth to a revised settlement that recovered the $37,200 plus sanctions. The hearing was set for February 12th. Ruth drove back to the mill with the counter-motion drafted and the evidence tabbed. She had 14 days, and for the first time since the divorce decree, she was not defending. She was auditing. And a full audit, as anyone who has endured one knows, does not end well for the person who lied. February 11th, 2024. The night before the hearing. Ruth was in the mill. The wood stove was burning. Spool was on the cot. The lockbox was on the workbench. Ruth had been sitting with it for an hour. The way you sit with a thing you have been avoiding, not because it frightens you, but because you know it will change the shape of everything that came before it. She opened the combination. 4/11/21. She removed the sealed envelope. She cracked the wax with her thumbnail gently, trying to preserve the quarter impression, and unfolded 2 pages of lined paper in Emmett's hand. The letter was dated June 2019. Ruth read, "Ruthie, if you're reading this, then it went the way I thought it would. I'm sorry about that. I spent 20 years hoping I was wrong." She held the pages in the lamplight and kept reading. "I found what was under this mill in 1983, and I spent the rest of my life making sure it would be here when you needed it. Not when you wanted it, when you needed it. There's a difference. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to stay in that marriage for the money. I wanted you to leave when you were ready, and I wanted this place to be here when you did. They will tell you I was just a mill operator. They will say the building is worthless and the land is dirt. Let them say it. I've been listening to people underestimate this creek my whole life. It cut through a mountain to get here. You think it cares what a surveyor writes on a piece of paper? I left you the hard thing, Ruth. Not the house, not the savings, not the easy assets. The hard one. Because you were the only one who ever stayed until the ledger balanced. You were the only one who came back every Saturday. You were the one who paid for my funeral and didn't flinch. You are the one I trust, with the thing that matters. Under this mill is a fortune. I don't know what lithium will be worth when you find this, but I know it will be worth more than what they took from you. The trust is yours. The rights are yours. The mill is yours. And nobody, not Glenn, not his attorney, not a judge, can take them. Finish the ledger, Ruthie. You always do. And at the bottom, in the same steady hand, I love you. I loved your mother. And I love this mill because it gave me a place to hide the best thing I ever did for either of you. Dad. Ruth did not cry immediately. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it, put it back in the envelope, and held it against her chest. She sat on the oak stool. She looked at the millstones, the workbench, the loading door open to the night, the creek running beyond in the dark. Spool jumped down from the cot and came to sit at her feet. Then she cried, not in collapse, in release, in the specific convulsive relief of a person who has been told by the one person whose judgment she trusted absolutely that she was not the one who failed. The wood stove ticked. The stool creaked under her. The creak ran. The letter rested against her chest like a hand on a wound. And for a while that was enough. February 12th, 2024. Henderson County Courthouse, Courtroom 3B. the same judge who had approved the original settlement. Glenn, Tara, and Harold Kemp on one side of the aisle. Ruth, Colleen Voss, and a tabbed evidence folder on the other. Kyle was not present. Kemp presented the motion to reopen the settlement. His argument was that Ruth had failed to disclose the mineral rights trust and that the court had been defrauded. He spoke with the same even administrative tone he had used in the conference room, as if this was simply a matter of correcting a filing error. Voss presented the defense. The trust had been created by Emmett Alder, not Ruth. Ruth had not known it existed until December 2023. The certified notification letter from the trustee's office had been sent in March 2021 to the marital address, 412 Laurel Ridge Road, and had never been received by Ruth. Moreover, and here Voss opened the tabbed folder and placed it before the judge, Glenn's own financial disclosure contained a material discrepancy. $37,200 had been withdrawn from the joint savings account between the date of separation and the date of the disclosure, and the withdrawal had not been reported. Glenn's attorney had signed the disclosure as accurate. The courtroom was quiet. Kemp asked for a recess. The judge denied it. The ruling came the same afternoon. The judge denied Glenn's motion to reopen the settlement. The Mineral Rights Trust was Emmett Alder's creation, not Ruth's asset to disclose. The trust was irrevocable and not subject to equitable distribution. Ruth had not known the trust existed until she found it in her father's mill, and the notification letter that should have informed her had been sent to an address controlled by the petitioner. Further, the judge referred the $37,200 discrepancy to the county district attorney for review. Harold Kemp was directed to show cause why he should not face a bar complaint for certifying an inaccurate financial disclosure. Glenn sat still. Tara stood up and left the courtroom without looking at Ruth. After the hearing, Voss drove Ruth back to Asheville. In her office, she showed Ruth a preliminary mineral lease estimate prepared by Appalachian Mineral Partners, the same company whose land agent had started all of this. Based on the 1983 and 1997 surveys, the confirmed schematic of the subsurface geology, and current market conditions, the lithium-bearing pegmatite deposit beneath parcel 1207441 was estimated to support a 30-year mineral lease worth approximately $11,400,000 in royalties. Ruth looked at the number. She looked at Voss. She said, "My father paid you $12,000 from a cigar box." Voss said, "He did, and he knew. He knew there was something valuable. I don't think he knew it would be this." Ruth sat with the number. It was not a celebration. It was a woman in an attorney's office looking at a figure that meant she would never be reduced to a 4-digit checking account balance again, and understanding that her father, the man Glenn had resented and Tara had dismissed and the county had tried to demolish around, had built this across 30 years from the inside of a stone mill no one thought was worth keeping. The fates of the people who had tried to take what wasn't theirs arrived in different shapes. Glenn was ordered to pay Ruth $37,200 plus $8,500 in sanctions for the asset concealment. His financial position, already stretched by the Laurel Ridge house payments, deteriorated. He did not face criminal charges. He went quiet. Harold Kemp received a formal reprimand from the North Carolina State Bar. His practice did not close, but his reputation in Henderson County carried a mark that would not wash off. Tara faced no legal consequence, but 6 weeks after the hearing, she sent Ruth a text. Not an apology, a question, "Did you know?" the whole time. Ruth did not respond. Kyle came to the mill 3 months after the hearing. He did not bring a lawyer or a folder. He brought a bag of cat food, Spool's brand, which he had asked about through the legal aid attorney. He stood in the loading doorway and said, "I should have said something. At the deposition, I knew it was wrong." Ruth let him in. They sat on the flagstone floor and did not talk for a while. It was not full reconciliation. It was a door left ajar, which is sometimes the most honest place to start. The mill was not demolished. Ruth used an advance against the mineral lease royalties, negotiated by Voss with Appalachian Mineral Partners, to pay the $9,200 in back taxes and fund the $45,000 structural remediation. The west wall was rebuilt with native granite to match the originals. The roof was restored. The loading door was refitted with new iron hinges forged in the old pattern. She did not move into the mill. She bought a small house in Buckner, 3 rooms, a porch, a view of the ridge, for $118,000. She walked to the mill every morning. What she did at the mill every morning was open the ledger. Not the old one, a new one. She was keeping books again. Ruth restored the older mill to operational status. The mineral extraction was handled by Appalachian Mineral Partners under a 30-year lease, conducted on the northern portion of the 12.4 acres away from the building. The mill itself was restored as a working grain mill, the first operational stone ground mill in Henderson County in 14 years. Ruth partnered with local farmers to create the Buckner Creek Grain Co-op, which ground heritage wheat and corn varieties for regional bakeries and farmers' markets. The co-op employed 7 people, including 2 who had been laid off from the same property management firm where Ruth once worked. Using a portion of the annual mineral lease royalties, Ruth established the Emmett Older Vocational Scholarship for displaced homemakers, women over 40 who were re-entering the workforce after divorce, caregiving, or economic displacement. The scholarship covered vocational training, certification programs, and 6 months of living expenses administered through the community college in Hendersonville. The first cohort of 8 women began in September 2024. The scholarship application did not ask about GPA or test scores. It asked one question Ruth wrote herself. What have you kept going when everyone told you to let it go? She did not rebuild her father's condemned cottage. She had it carefully disassembled, salvaging the heart pine flooring and the stone chimney. The heart pine became the new shelving in the mill. The chimney stone was incorporated into a memorial bench beside the creek, with a small brass plate, the same type as the water level marker, engraved with 3 words and 2 initials, EA. He paid attention. On a Saturday morning in early spring, Ruth was in the mill, at the workbench which had been refinished, the warp sanded out, the surface oiled. The oak stool was beneath her. The new ledger was open. The lockbox was on a shelf above the bench. Closed, the wax-sealed envelope returned to its place inside. Spool was on the millstone. The runner stone had been reset in its housing. Ruth had hired a millwright to do it properly, but she was the one who showed him where the axle housing was and what had been hidden inside it. The millstone turned now. The creek drove it. Ruth had had the mill race cleared and the sluice gate restored. Water ran through the channel the way it had in 1921. The loading door was open. Through it, Ruth could see the creek, the ridge, the dogwoods beginning to bloom white along Buckner Creek. The air smelled like stone dust and fresh ground wheat. On the workbench, beside the ledger, was the birthday card, the bluebird, faded from the dollar store in Hendersonville. September 22nd, 1997. The trust number written inside in Emmett's hand, 974418MA. Ruth closed the ledger. The columns balanced. The mill had been there since 1921. It had survived floods and storms and a county demolition order and a family that forgot what it was built on. It survived because Emmett Older built it to last, and because his daughter, the one who always came back on Saturdays, was the only one who believed him. She picked up the pencil. Saturday morning, same as always. The creek ran. The stone turned, and the ledger, as it always had been when Ruth Older kept it, was balanced.